With nearly a century of history as a permanent collection here at Longwood Gardens, the orchids hold a special place among our other core collections. In this lesson, you will learn about Pierre S. DuPont, our founder, and his wife Alice, and how they were instrumental in the American Orchid Society. We'll also learn about how our collection came to encompass over 6,000 orchids. We have a number of new and notable orchids in our collection. Thank you for joining us as we learn about the history of the orchids here at Longwood Gardens.
Orchids have always been a part of Longwood Gardens. They were one of the earliest collections, starting in 1921, and have grown and expanded under the direction of Pierre S. DuPont, several directors, and 12 orchid growers. Through acquisition, donations, and breeding, we will take a look at how the 2,600 accessions and over 6,000 plants have made their way into the collection and the forefront of our innovative horticulture display. Our founder, Pierre S. DuPont, was always fascinated by orchids. He and his mother, Mrs. Lamott, Mary Boleyn DuPont, had a small orchid collection at their estate, St. Amour, where his sister-in-law, Mrs. W.K. Ethel Fleet Halleck DuPont, resided from 1907 to 1913, following the unfortunate passing of her husband. Together, Pierre and Mrs. W.K. DuPont developed a mutual appreciation for orchids that would dramatically influence our current collection. Adoration for orchids was not new or novel at the time. Orchids were being shown by amateur growers and professionals at the New York, Philadelphia, and Boston flower shows as early as the mid-1800s. At the turn of the century, orchids were increasing in popularity as houseplants and for their cut flowers, with special interest in the genus Cattleya. Pierre's personal passion for orchids continued to develop alongside his sister-in-law, Mrs. W.K. DuPont. While Pierre was building the original gardens and earliest fountains at Longwood Gardens, his sister-in-law was amassing a world-renowned collection of orchids at her estate, Still Pond, in the picturesque Brandywine River Valley. Still Pond included a series of glasshouses that were constructed to house Mrs. W.K. DuPont's ever-expanding collection of orchids and other horticultural specimens. Her personal passion for orchids led her to present at the orchid shows along the East Coast in New York City, the Philadelphia Flower Show, and others. Mrs. W.K. DuPont's role in the knowledge of the culture and care of orchids and her zeal for acquiring and growing world-class specimens is documented in an article published by the American Orchid Society in October 2007. The beginnings of the orchid collection at Longwood started with the construction of the main conservatory from 1919 through 1921. The orchid collection was bolstered in 1922 when the wife of Pierre, Alice B. DuPont, received a gift of 12 Cattleya from Mrs. Dimmick of Scranton, Pennsylvania. Alice was equally as fascinated with the orchid family, or Orchidaceae, and together with Pierre acquired many of the first plants to go on display alongside the gifted Cattleya, a genus that was near and dear to Alice. She was eventually honored when Walter Off of Waldo Orchids named a beautiful white Cattleya in her honor. In the 1920s, Alice and Pierre became charter members of the American Orchid Society alongside 100 other orchid enthusiasts. Pierre, Alice, and Mrs. W.K. DuPont were all active in the leadership of the society. Alice was a long-standing vice president, and in 1933 and 1934, Longwood welcomed exhibitors and members of the American Orchid Society to the gardens for the 5th and 6th National Orchid Exhibitions. 1924 marked a very important moment for the collection at Longwood, as it welcomed Louis Jacoby as the first orchid grower. Throughout his tenure, he worked alongside many of Longwood's other skilled horticulturalists and took care of the growing collection. His notes and many of his images are part of our vast archives. Throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s, Alice and Pierre purchased extensively from American growers as well as imported from India, Thailand, and the Caribbean, and selected plants from top growers in England, France, and Belgium. But one of the largest and most significant additions was the 2,314 orchids donated by Mrs. W.K. DuPont in the early 1950s. Along with this generous gift, Bruce Scott, who had been a grower for Mrs. DuPont, joined the staff and worked alongside Louis Jacobi, becoming the orchid grower after Jacobi's death in 1956. The first director of Longwood, Dr. Russell Seibert, introduced a research component to the orchid collection. During a trip to Kirstenbosch National Botanical Garden in South Africa, he was given seedlings of Disa uniflora. The progeny of these first seedlings remains an active part of our breeding and research program and will be highlighted later on in the course. These plants are usually on display in the summer months, which coincides with their blooming period. In the 1960s, another exciting development was the extensive use of Cymbidium in the conservatory well beyond the orchid house. The collection continued to evolve through acquisition, collection, and breeding, but other substantial gifts have added to its diversity. In the mid-1980s, this stunning Dendrobium speciosum variation grandiflorum and 183 other orchids were gifted to Longwood by Dr. Sam Bright of Australia. Its robust size and floriferous nature always delight guests when it is on display. In 2001, Mount Cuba Center in Hockessin, Delaware, offered 274 orchids that were a significant portion of Mrs. Lamont DuPont Copeland's personal collection. And even more recently, Longwood volunteer and orchid lover Dwayne Erdman contributed 236 of his own demure and dainty Restrepia and Zootrophion species and selections. While the infrastructure of the Orchid House remains a strong legacy for our largest collection, the desire to expand the display of orchids took on new life in 2007 with the establishment of the first Orchid Extravaganza. In its inaugural display, Longwood filled the conservatory for 6 weeks with an abundance of fresh-cut orchids and over 1,300 potted specimens. With Vanda in the fern passage, exciting sprays of Cymbidium, gorgeous photographs on exhibit, interpretive displays, and the very first orchid curtain, this display was an instant success. The exhibition kicked off with the Southeastern Pennsylvania Orchid Society show called Winter Escape, shown here. With its immense success, the extravaganza has now become one of the 5 major seasons at Longwood, and every year it provides a new and innovative look and feel. Throughout the first 10 years, it has included a variety of thrilling features like the hanging and potted Cymbidium in the Acacia Passage. Massive arches have graced the exhibition hall and East Conservatory. These large structures utilize over 850 individual plants and are truly a work of art. Various sizes of hanging orb baskets are constructed by our talented facilities team and designed with exciting color combinations of Phalaenopsis by our horticulturalists. These baskets are hung high above guests throughout the conservatory. Several different curtains comprised of Phalaenopsis and Cattleya as well as foliage plants have been the focal point of displays in the exhibition hall. A series of different orchid meadows that were focused on a diverse display of terrestrial and epiphytic orchids have previously been installed in the East Conservatory. Our design team has also suspended hundreds of Vanda above the dry riverbed in the Silver Garden. Orchid Extravaganza has developed into a 10-week display that now has 2 to 3 successions of installations amassing over 5,000 potted specimens. There will be more information about how Longwood designs and constructs these awe-inspiring display elements later in this course. While Orchid Extravaganza brings thousands of orchids into the conservatory, only a small percentage make their way into the permanent collection. Our curatorial staff and orchid grower select those plants which we may not already have to avoid redundancy and accession many of the rare and unusual orchids that will become part of Longwood's orchid collection. The large exhibition orchid, Phalaenopsis sogoeuchidion V3, which have featured prominently in Orchid Extravaganza, have found their way into the permanent collection through the relationships that we have developed over the years with many different growers. Beyond the Orchid House and the massive infusion of orchids for Orchid Extravaganza, there is another aspect of the orchid collection that has evolved over time. With an emphasis on some of the over 55 native species of orchids in Pennsylvania, there is increased interest in conserving and breeding Spiranthes, Cypripedium, and other native species. While this collection includes plants with seasonal interest, Their relevance to the greater collection is also paramount to our mission and vision. Benefiting from advancements in technology and the tissue culture lab at Longwood Gardens, many propagation challenges have been overcome, leading to new efforts for both hardy and tropical orchid breeding. The collection continues to expand, and current efforts to increase the presentation of summer-blooming orchids in the genus Habenaria are underway. Breeding programs based on Habenaria rhodokyla, shown here, and several other species have developed under the direction of Greg Griffiths, our orchid grower, and Peter Zale, the Associate Director of Conservation, Plant Breeding, and Collections. A rotation of specimens like the black orchid, Fred Clarkiara After Dark, SVO Black Pearl, recently acquired European terrestrials from the genus Ophrys, and the relatively newly discovered Phragmipedium kovachii have also been added to the rotation of plants on display throughout the year. Throughout the enhancements to the original footprint, the Orchid House has remained one of the most popular attractions at Longwood. This is a testament to our heritage and the importance of this collection, as it offers guests a chance to see 200 to 300 specimens in peak bloom every day of the year. With nearly a century of history, the Longwood Orchid Collection goes far beyond the beauty and rotational display. It is a story of the icons in horticulture that gifted or cared for these amazing plants.